Recording has started. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Ulrich Schlie from Bonn and myself on behalf of both our organizations of CASIS in Bonn and the University of Aberdeen, the Center for Global Security and Governance, to our latest version or edition of the Aberdeen and Bonn Global Conversations. It's my great pleasure to welcome today Dia Roy, who's going to speak about the Nazi study of India and Indian anti-colonialism, followed by a short response by Dr. Mishka Sinha, and afterwards we'll very quickly go into an open discussion. For those of you unfamiliar with the format of these events, we try to be as interactive as we can. Dia Roy is a lecturer and researcher affiliated to the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. Her first monograph, The Making of a Gentleman Nazi, Albert Speer's Politics of History in the Federal Republic of Germany, was published in 2016 by Peter Lang. She has spoken and published widely on various subjects, including Nazi Germany, German Indianology, and historical connections between India and Germany. Her new book, about which she's speaking today, is now out with Oxford University Press. Mishka Sinha is the curator for inclusive history at Historic Royal Palaces. She holds a PhD from Cambridge University, as well as a master's degree from Oxford. She formerly held positions at Edinburgh, Oxford, and the European University Institute in Florence, as well as also a position in Berlin. But now, without any further ado, we look forward to Dia first giving us an overview of maybe 20-25 minutes about her book before we then go into the response paper.
Thank you so much for this introduction. By the way, my official name is Baijayanti, so don't get scared if you see a different name on the cover of the book and on this PowerPoint. But Dia is the name that it's shorter and easier to pronounce, so everybody calls me Dia, including my colleagues. So thank you so much, Thomas, for organizing this event. This is an honor for me, of course. And Mishka, it's great to see you. So this book originates from...
Can I very briefly interrupt and do something extremely impolite?
Yeah.
Julia, can you take over, be the chair for the next 2 or 3 minutes while Dia will start talking, and I'll be back in 2 or 3 minutes. I'll explain later why I have to run off.
Sure, no worries at all.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to your talk, Dia.
Yeah. So this book originates from a research project that I carried out under Professor Moritz Epple at the Goethe University, Frankfurt am Main, from 2018 to 2021. The project was funded by DFG, or the German Research Foundation, and it was called Indology in Nazi Germany. In German academic tradition, the term Indology is generally used to represent a broad category encompassing a number of fields concerned with the study of literary cultures, primarily of ancient India. However, in the book which resulted from this project, I have used the term Indology sparingly. I have used the more generic knowledge of India instead. This is because the monograph explains the ways in which different kinds of knowledge pertaining to India's modern history and contemporary politics were used by German scholars, non-academic India experts, and some Indian anti-colonial intellectuals in order to fulfill certain political goals of Nazi Germany. I have used the term Indologist to refer only to scholars who specialized in their doctoral dissertation and habilitation on academic subjects belonging to the traditional orbit of Indology, like Vedic, Sanskrit, Indian religions, scripts, and so on. One of the central concerns of this book is to demonstrate how these scholars who studied Indology, which pertained mostly to ancient India, could nevertheless become valued knowledge providers on modern India for the Nazi regime. As far as the connections between academic study of India and Germany and Nazi politics are concerned, The first comprehensive and critical publication was a very controversial essay by Sheldon Pollock. I suppose he needs no introduction, the famous Sanskrit scholar from America, published in 1993. In the essay titled Deep Orientalism, Notes on Sanskrit and Power Beyond the Raj, Pollock claimed, um, can you see Pollock's quotation?
Yes, we can do.
Okay. So the PowerPoint is working. Yeah. So Pollock claimed that Sanskritists in the NS state functioned as experts in legitimation by extrapolating and deepening the existing myth of Aryan origin, as well as other aspects of philological and historical Indology, to answer the regime's search for authenticity. This essay was strongly denounced in the German academia, which refused to accept that the German Indologists had anything to do with Nazi politics. So this probably explains why only a few critical works on the subject have been published since the publication of Pollock's essay and my own book. Most of these publications focus on the three prominent Indologists: Walter Wurst, University of Munich; Jacob Wilhelm Hauer, University of Tübingen; and Erich Frauwallner, University of Vienna. I call these three the unholy trinity of German Indology. Just a minute, I'm trying to show you the next slide. Yeah. So Wurst and Hauer were discredited in 1945 due to their very visible proximity to the Nazi political establishment, but Frauwallner could continue his academic career after a short hiatus. It was Walter Wurst, expert on Rig Veda, professor at the University of Munich, and high-ranking member of the SS, who set the tone for the German Indologists in the Third Reich. Third Reich is always within quotes, through an article written in 1939 titled Die Deutsche Aufgabe der Indologie, or the German Tasks of Indology. In this essay, Wurst claimed that the German taxpayers had the right to expect from professors of Indology a subject without a practical use, that they should strive for achieving in their academic works a close connection with the prevalent German Kulturpolitik, or cultural politics. In Nazi Germany, cultural politics denoted propagating the glories of the Third Reich and its supreme leader, as well as collecting politically valuable knowledge about people and situations within and outside the Reich. My book takes Wurst's call to his colleagues as the starting point to look at the nature of the connections between scholars and experts on India with Nazi politics. So now we see how the scholars trained in subjects related to ancient India became transformed into knowledge providers on modern India. So I have examined 4 organizations as case studies to demonstrate the different patterns of entanglements of knowledge of India and Nazi politics. I will give you brief descriptions of the case studies, which I have presented as individual chapters in my book. The first case study is of the India Institute of the Deutsche Akademie, or DA, a private cultural organization founded in Munich by some academics in 1925 to disseminate German language and culture in the world. The India Institute, established in 1928, was the first of a number of committees within the DA that was formed for specific nations. The India Institute came into being through the efforts of Tarak Nath Das, an Indian nationalist living in Europe at the time, and Karl Haushofer, professor of geography at the University of Munich, who had visited India and had developed sympathy for the colonized Indians, and he was very, very anti-British. Therefore, Indian nationalist aspirations and the intention of spreading German influence in the world were the 2 dominant impulses behind the formation of the India Institute. Its main task was to provide scholarships and stipends to Indians to study and train in German universities, laboratories, and companies. Knowledge of India was obviously required to mediate between these German institutions and the Indians who came to Germany, and who were expected to further German interests in India after their return. Such knowledge was provided by a number of academics who specialized on India. They were expected to propagate the virtues of Germany after their return. Like its parent body, the India Institute claimed to be a non-political entity with the sole objective of promoting cultural ties with India. In reality, both the Deutsche Akademie and the India Institute identified with various political concerns of the successive German governments. Till 1933, the Institute tried to fulfill this objective by subtly encouraging India's nationalist aspirations without antagonizing the British. From 1933 to about 1939, under the influence of Hauer and to a much greater extent Walter Wurst, Indian anti-colonialism was accorded less importance than propagating Nazi worldview in India. During this period, the Institute provided a platform to Hindu mystics and revivalists as well as Indian anthropologists to propagate Aryanism and Aryan race science in the form of lectures, essays, and books. From 1938, after Joachim von Ribbentrop became the foreign minister and war with Britain appeared inevitable, this was a turning point in my story. German propaganda began to openly support the Indian anti-colonial movement. The aim was to cause political disturbances in India and thereby weaken the British Empire. There was no inherent sympathy for Indian nationalism. After the Second World War started, the India Institute, which was by then totally Nazified, brought Indian nationalism back into its agenda. Throughout the war, it continued to promote anti-British books written ostensibly by Indians as well as Germans through its journals. I say ostensibly because we'll see that there's some complication there. The second case study deals with the Special Department India or Sonderreferat Indien, which I refer to as SRI, of the German Foreign Ministry. The strategic anti-British pro-Indian nationalist propaganda conducted by the German Foreign Ministry from 1938 received an impetus after the Indian anti-colonialist politician who's quite iconic in India, in Calcutta, where I come from, Subhas Chandra Bose, 1897-1945, who arrived in Berlin as a political refugee in April 1941. Bose sought Germany's help to free India militarily. In response to Bose's demands, the German Foreign Ministry formed the SRI in May 1941 to formulate and conduct German strategy regarding India. Two projects undertaken by the SRI best illustrate the collusion between knowledge production on India, Bose's anti-colonial concerns, and the demands of Nazi politics. First were fortnightly reports on the current developments in India written for Ribbentrop. And the second was a series of German books on modern India, supposedly written by 4 Germans and 4 Indians. Once again, I say supposedly. While the reports were to serve as guidelines for the German press in its coverage of Indian events, the books were manifestations of the Nazi government's tactical expression of sympathy for Indian anti-colonialism and as informal guidebooks for officials tasked with shaping German policy concerning India. The knowledge required for these projects were culled from various sources, including Indian informants, international press, and subsequently classified and molded into strategically important tracts by German academics and non-scholarly India experts. The Indologist Ludwig Alsdorf played the impresario in both the ventures. This chapter examines his involvement with Nazi politics and his evolution from a scholar of Jainism, an ancient monastic religion of India, to a politically engaged knowledge provider and gatekeeper of knowledge production on India at the SRI. He fulfilled the criteria of an ideal Nazi scholar as demanded by Walter Wurst. Alsdorf was assisted by a non-scholarly but famous India expert, Franz Josef Furtwängler. He was an erstwhile trade unionist and social democrat who had visited India and written popular accounts of his travels. His participation at the SRI underscores his, as well as the Nazi regime's pragmatism, since, as we all know, all forms of leftist politics were anathema to the Nazis. This chapter also inspects the role of a few Berlin-based Indian anti-colonialists who were involved in these two projects. While two of them were allowed to contribute on an occasional fortnightly report, a number of others were denied the status of knowledge providers, mainly due to the interventions of Alstorf. The books written by Indians for the series were rejected, and they were rewritten by Germans and often published under the names of the Indians. Hence, I use the words ostensibly and supposedly. This chapter contends that the interracial relationships, the process of knowledge production, as well as the usability of the knowledge discourses were influenced not only by the prevailing political situation, but also by certain racialized assumptions and political prejudices which were common to both German Indology and the Nazi worldview. The third case study examines the German and Indian academics teaching practical aspects of modern India at the Oriental Seminar, or rather Seminar for Oriental Languages, established in 1887 at the Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm Universität zu Berlin, which is now the Humboldt University, and the successor to the Oriental Seminar. It had two successor organizations, the Ausland Hochschule, or AH, established in 1937, and the twin organizations with really big names, Auslandswissenschaftlichen Fakultät, or AF, for teaching, and the Deutsche Auslandswissenschaftliches Institut, DAWI, for research. Both were formed in 1940. The third case study begins by tracing the study of contemporary Indian languages and Realian, that is practical subjects, like India's history, geography, socio-political and economic situation at the Seminar for Oriental Studies. The study of India and other countries here was meant to serve the colonial and commercial aims of the newly formed Second Reich in 1871. The scholars involved in the seminar were expected to use their specialized knowledge to serve the German state both in and outside the classroom. So Gujarati was taught here from the beginning, so that Germans in Africa, in their colonies in Africa, which had a substantial Gujarati population, could interact with them. But all the scholars involved in the seminar were expected to use their specialized knowledge to serve the German state both in and outside the classroom. The first teacher who taught Gujarati here, Vacha, Parsi from India, also formed commercial relationships with Indians in India. He mediated between German firms and Indian firms. This trend intensified after 1933. The lessons imparted in the classrooms became less important for the Nazi state than the political services that the scholars could provide by deploying their expert knowledge of India for various Nazi organs. Teaching positions thus came to be increasingly used as sinecures and rewards for politically useful services and as covers for such activities. These activities were primarily disseminating pro-Nazi and anti-British propaganda in India as well as Germany. By the time AF and DAWI came into existence in 1940, knowledge of foreign countries had become another ideological battlefront, as envisaged by the ever-powerful SS, which wielded considerable influence in these organizations. However, the usefulness of the academics attached to the AF and the DAWI continued to be linked to their political functions outside the classroom. They found their uses for the war effort by censoring letters of soldiers, tapping foreign radio programs, broadcasting radio propaganda in India, and translating items of the press, apart from writing propagandistic articles for German and Indian newspapers. Among the Indian experts who were not trained Indologists involved in these organizations were the two Indian lectors of Hindi and Urdu, Tarachand Roy and Devendranath Banerjee, the German lectors Reinhard Wagner, who taught Bengali, and Hermann Bertan, who was a missionary and a reputed scholar of Tamil. A professorial post for Indian studies focusing on contemporary India was set up by the SS in 1943. It was given to the aforementioned Ludwig Alstorf, though it had nothing to do with Alstorf's field of academic expertise, Jainism. Now we come to the fourth and the last case study, which focuses on a number of India experts who functioned as interpreters with the Indian Legion that was set up jointly by Subhash Chandra Bose and the Wehrmacht, or the German armed forces, in 1941. The Legion comprised about 3,500 volunteers from the Indian prisoners of war who belonged to the British Imperial Army that had fought the Germans in Africa. In order to integrate the newly formed Legion into the Wehrmacht, the Indian soldiers needed to be trained by the German military personnel. For this, interpreters were indispensable. An important element of this training was ideological indoctrination in Nazi worldview. Right from the beginning, the Wehrmacht intended to exercise full control over the Indian Legion through political propaganda, glorifying the achievements of Nazi Germany and its Führer, as well as by convincing the soldiers of the righteousness of Germany's war. A number of scholars were called upon as interpreters to mediate between the Wehrmacht and the Indian soldiers. The chief interpreter was Ernst Bannert, a Catholic pastor and an expert of Persian and Arabic, who also knew Urdu, a language spoken mostly by Muslims in India and, of course, now in Pakistan. In those times, Urdu was the predominant language taught widely in North India. Other interpreters included Otto Spies, another scholar of Persian and Arabic who made a career as a professor at the University of Bonn after the war. The Indologists Paul Thieme and Karl Hofmann, who were also famous, and the evangelical pastor Eugene Rose, who had studied Indology. This chapter examines the levels of involvement of these scholars in Nazi politics before joining the Legion, as well as their role as political indoctrinators within the Legion. A vehicle of such indoctrination was the Legion's magazine called Bhai Band, written in Urdu and Hindustani and edited by Bannert with the help of Indian soldiers. After Bannert defected to the Allies in 1943, this task was performed by Thieme, Hofmann, and Rose. This chapter analyzes the magazine to demonstrate how it deployed various tropes of Indian nationalism as well as Nazi political and military propaganda in order to encourage the Indian soldiers to fight. So each of these chapters has an epilogue which briefly touching upon the issue of continuity with the past after 1945. As we saw, a number of Indologists who were involved in these organizations went on to make successful careers after the war. The epilogues analyzed the process of coping with the past, or Vergangenheitsbewältigung as it's called in German, which enabled these scholars to elide their involvement with Nazi politics and integrate into West German academia. The epilogues also deconstruct the continuing myth about the independence and detachment of Subhas Bose's anti-colonialist venture from Nazi politics. It's still widely believed that Bose had nothing to do with the Nazis. He just took some help. The conclusion sums up the key outcomes of the study. I don't want to give away too much. The research questions that this book has tried to answer include those that are commonly raised by historians probing the connections between scholars of humanities and Nazi politics, as well as some additional ones generated by the particular context of this study. Generally, this work has tried to ascertain whether providing intellectual capital yielded more valuable remunerations to the knowledge providers in the form of increased career prospects, financial gains, or accumulation of power and influence. The conclusion also looks at some of the long and short-term effects of the entanglements of knowledge of India and Nazi politics and calls for further research on the subject. This book is, after all, just the beginning. Thank you for your attention.
Tom, you're muted.
Well, that happens if you mute me, Julia. Well, many thanks for of course, Julia was supposed to mute me. Many thanks for a wonderful introduction to your book, which will start as a great starting point for our discussion. And of course, all have, I'm sure, has whetted our interest or appetite to read the entire book. I certainly am super excited about this. I mean, I've been excited about Dia's work for a long time, but in this particular case, I'm currently finishing a book on Nazi disinformation warfare in the 1930s. This is really very exciting indeed. But I asked Mishka Sinha to provide a response, because while I'm excited, she is even more knowledgeable, and I think knowledgeable is better than being excited.
Thank you. Is that a cue for me to speak? Right. Thank you very much. I am excited and knowledgeable. Well, a little bit knowledgeable, but very excited. Thank you so much, Dia. That was really interesting. I did have the privilege of looking through some of your book. I'm afraid I didn't manage to read the whole thing. So just kind of briefly to tell other people, my PhD at Cambridge was on the history of Sanskrit studies in Britain and the United States. And so I have I do have some understanding and some knowledge of what was happening in Germany at the same time, although that isn't the focus of my study. But there are lots of connections between what Dia's doing and and the research that I did. But what she's clearly found and what she's clearly worked on is things that I think areas that have not been looked at, particularly the new material she's looked at in archives is really exciting. And I'm really looking forward to getting a better understanding of the insights that's going to yield. The thing about this book is that it's so, what's really admirable is how both broad and specific it is, and it's a really hard task, because Dia's taken questions that are very broad and very complex, and they're questions that I think in many ways affect all of us who work in the humanities, which is questions of how knowledge and power interact with each other at the very broadest level, and particularly in the context of colonialism and other political formations where there are deep inequalities, which are then integrated into the ways in which knowledge is constructed, collated, and disseminated. So, and that at the very broadest level is why this research is really relevant to anybody who's interested in those questions. But the specific cases that Dia has looked at are absolutely fascinating, because they integrate, and Dia makes a point in her introduction where she talks about how she's not claiming to join the fashionable bandwagon of transnational history, and yet her work is deeply, as somebody who does work with transnational and global history, is deeply transnational, because it integrates histories that are normally bordered and bounded by nationalistic concerns, and that therefore fail to penetrate some of these broader questions in a way that's actually useful and illuminating. So for me, I mean, I think that I'm not competent to comment on the book so much as to really ask some questions of my own and see whether those questions might help us get this discussion going further, and then we can open it up to other people. So I have questions about sort of 4 different things areas where I think our interests intersect, because obviously I'm not, that's what I'm feel competent to ask questions about in particular, and the areas that I'm interested in. So the first one is really just to begin with this kind of idea of Indology and the knowledge of India, and the politics of those who chose to deploy it, so the usable knowledge that that you talked about. And I'm going to be very careful here because you've made a very important distinction between Indology and knowledge of India. But here I'm going to talk about Indology. And I'm interested in thinking about, just as a kind of counterpoint, Jewish scholars of India who are really actually quite important and quite significant, particularly to the dissemination of the study of Sanskrit beyond Germany, because German scholars, after that brief period in Paris in the kind of late 18th, early 19th century, it's really German scholars who are the acknowledged experts in Sanskrit and Indian and knowledge of India. And they are the pioneers of that knowledge initially in Britain and the United States, for example, in the Anglophone world. So there's a Jewish scholar called Friedrich Rosen, who is a student of Bopp's, who comes to UCL and is the first person to teach Sanskrit at a university in this country. It's not the Bowdoin professorship. It is this early teaching by Friedrich Rosen, and then you have H.H. Wilson at Oxford. And very soon after that, there's Isaac Nordheimer, who is from a region now known as, now I think in Hungary, who goes over to New York, and in the 1830s and early 1840s starts teaching Sanskrit. And it's actually, you can see it in the archives of New York, what was then known as the University of the City of New York. And then, and it continues because also Jewish scholars have trouble getting jobs in Germany, even in, as you know, even in the 19th century. And so often they get jobs outside, and they get jobs in the British Empire, and they become key to the study of Indology, even as late as the 1930s. There's a scholar who you might probably know of called Betty Hyman, who was professor. Yeah. And so she's, and she has to leave because her professorship is she loses her professorship after 1933, and she comes to Britain. She teaches at SOAS for a while, and then she ends up opening the Sanskrit department in Colombo. So again, pioneering Sanskrit in the British Empire. So I think I just wondered in what ways you feel that the ideological aspect of this is being engaged with, because there is an enormous amount of ideology in the way in which Sanskrit is presented in the West from the beginning, from the 19th century. And as you pointed out, that whole, the fact that actually early, in most of the period of history that we know of in India, that we have any knowledge of, the texts that I looked at are not these primary Vedic Sanskrit texts. It's the Manusmriti, and it's these later texts that are really kind of creating Hinduism, and so as it's practiced. But there is this kind of idea of this Vedic Sanskrit that is the pure Sanskrit that everybody's going back to, and that has that integrated ideology from the beginning. That's and how's that being kind of engaged with? So that's my first area. The second, shall I let you respond to that and then go back, because then otherwise I'm just talking, or would you like me to just kind of come up, try to frame my overall questions and then respond to me? What would you like to do, Dia?
Well, I can briefly answer this question because I'm not good at remembering stuff.
Okay.
So
Fair enough.
Yeah, this is something very important. And actually, I'm teaching a course at the moment which is called Aryans and Semites in German Indology, and how scholars kind of projected their imaginations of Aryanism onto India and eliminated the Indians from the story. So it was the Nordic Germans who went to India, and they formed India's history. They brought culture to India, so on and so forth. We know that story. But as far as these four institutes are concerned, as far as this book is concerned, there are some Jewish scholars who are involved. There are very sad stories in the India Institute. From the beginning, there are these couple of very famous Jewish scholars. who are involved. And after 1933, they're unceremoniously expelled. They are, the Journal of the India Institute says, oh, they have chosen to retire, which is an euphemism for we kicked them out. And one of them goes to US, Lucien Sherman, who was an ethnologist and an Indologist, and he was already quite advanced in years, and he died after a few years. And the other one is Otto Strauss, who was very famous and who had gone to India, and he was actually jailed by the British during the First World War as an enemy allied, and he was chucked out from the advisory committee of the India Institute. He lost his professorship at Breslau, and he had to, on top of it, he had to nominate his Aryan successor, which was Paul Thieme, who comes in to the fourth chapter. And Strauss tries to eke out a living in Berlin. He can't. Then he goes to Holland, and when the Nazis invade Holland, he just dies of a heart attack. So these are very sad stories. And the ideological Sanskrit part of it, which you mentioned, that comes in very rarely, because this is modern India they are interested in. But Walter Wust, for example, brings this in. He organizes this essay competition for Indians, which says the common Aryan, write the best essay on the common Aryan origin of the swastika. And so it's more marginal. I hope I understood your question and I could answer. I don't know.
No, I mean, I think the thing is, I mean, I think that's basically what I was trying to push towards, really. How do we frame these scholars who are engaging with an area of knowledge that has deep racial overtones right from the 19th century? We know this. We know that in the 19th century, language and race are deeply interconnected. Maurice Oleander's book about the language of the past, and we know this, and that is there. Max Muller talks about it, and has been asked, and we've got lots of debates about, was Max Muller aware of the, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so much of this sort of this knowledge that already exists, and yet you continue to have say South Asians engaging with it, and within this framework that is deeply racist and deeply racialized, and also with Jewish scholars. So it's interesting that, I mean, I'm trying to push towards a better understanding, which we're not going to get in this conversation, of how we're able, how there is this capacity that we have as scholars to apparently separate some, our assumptions of pure knowledge from the tainted roots that knowledge is subject to, that that we're somehow able to kind of blind ourselves to that and continue. So that was really what I was. So that's one thing. The other thing that I want to really quickly ask about is the sort of relationship with the British Empire that you talk about a bit, whether you can elaborate on that. And in relation to that, so the third kind of element in this, and this is just my interest, which is American Indology. And I'm interested in it because it's really if you like, the ancestor, the American kind of strain of scholarship about Sanskrit in India is the ancestor of people like Sheldon Pollock, who have come out and then critiqued, and created this argument, which is a very valid, and I know that's from Peter van der Veer, and the post-colonialism and Orientalism, the predicament, and it's a really important essay. But at the same time, it also has its own assumptions, which are to do with the way in which the Western traditions of knowledge of India continue to operate in the US, in Britain, where there are certain kind of assumptions that are made about how, for example, who gets to teach Indology, and Indians, whether or not they are competent to be able to study their own or disseminate their own knowledge and their own scholarship. And those, I think, and I don't think, and I'm not suggesting that Sheldon Pollock is therefore integrating that, or in any way that his chapter is saying these things about race, but I do think that there is a line of knowledge tradition, which goes from Germany to the US, which is this idea of a kind of scientific Wissenschaft, the Wissenschafts part of the Indology, which is a scientific knowledge of India that is extractable from the messiness of culture. And there are underlying assumptions that I think continue to underpin the way in which Sanskrit is understood to be, that somehow you can separate it. And that, and that Western traditions are often the way to separate, the way that there is a kind of scientificity that operates, that allows Western traditions of knowledge about South Asia or other places, and to an extent I'm playing devil's advocate here, because I'm not, I'm from that tradition, and I also come out of that human sciences tradition. But I just think that I just think it's interesting to look at where these ideas of India in the US are coming from, because because the scholars of Sanskrit and Indology in the United States from the beginning studied in Germany. And so there is a long inheritance. And I wondered whether you think that there is anything to be learnt from that tradition and the way it's playing out now in terms of what's happening to Sanskrit departments in America, and people like Pollock's concerns and our own concerns about the nexus between ideas of Indology and ancient India, which are all too often given credence and credibility through invoking Western, Western approval of Indian scholarship, and Western scholars who've talked about how brilliant Indian scholarship is. That that then ends up, I'm sorry, I'm putting this very badly. Contemporary ideas of Hinduism and India, which are based in ideas of ancient India and of a certain kind of ancient India and of a monolithic cultural tradition, which is rooted in Vedic culture, is often given credibility and underlined and emphasized by using Western scholarship to kind of to say, yes, see how great this is, see how true this is. There are all these Western scholars who have said this is true, and that is used by contemporary Hindutva, but at the same time there continues to be a critique of Western interference or Western kind of commentary. So I suppose what I'm asking is that where do you see the nexus between the way in which knowledge and power are playing out and the ways in which these ideologies are playing out in the 1930s with the Indians and the kind of the Western scholars involved, and the ways in which that knowledge continues to be used now, and how that is being critiqued or not critiqued in relation to Western traditions of knowledge. Because, for example, the book that you mentioned with the IT specialist in America.
Yeah, right.
So that is also made possible through American academia.
Yeah.
Giving credence to that kind of, that intellectual formation. It's not being given credence through Indian academia alone. There is, in a sense, greater credibility because that book has been published in America.
I don't know whether this book has been published in the US, but definitely it's been published with the money of this very famous public Indologist, self-styled Indologist and historian, Rajiv Malhotra.
Yeah.
He's quite famous. The German Indologists are scared of him, which means he's got this public following. And I don't know what his credentials as Indologists are. I know he's a tech millionaire or billionaire, and he has this kind of publishing empire, and he pushes this pro-Hindutva agenda by using, as you said, he uses certain Indological view of Western Indological view of history to kind of critique people like Pollock. I mean, he kind of, as far as I know, he kind of uses the more more conventional Max Muller Vedic India Golden Age kind of stuff to critique people like Pollock for claiming that Sanskrit was in any way related to Nazism. I mean, it sounds quite complicated, but actually it's quite crudely put, that the Sanskrit is our wonderful language and it belonged to an Indian golden age, and how can this American suggest that Sanskrit scholars were related in any way with Nazi politics, and how can he kind of demean Sanskrit by bringing it into connection with Nazi politics. Pollock gave more examples of people like Wurst and Howard using their knowledge of, say, Bhagavad Gita or Buddhist texts or whatever to legitimize Nazism. Howard, for example, his quite infamous book on Bhagavad Gita as a book of Kampf und Tat, as a book of war and deed, is actually a legitimation of the SS ideology. And it said that Himmler personally loved this book. And Himmler read out Bhagavad Gita to his SS to tell him that they are the reborn Kshatriyas, and it's their dharma, it's their duty to kill. And Howard provides a very academic sounding legitimation of this particular SS credo, that you are born to kill, it's your duty to kill, it's not a sin to kill. You are killing in the name of what is true and what is good. And this is the really dense academically written stuff on Bhagavad Gita, interpreting it in terms of what would appeal to the SS. And then Howard used to give lectures to the German army, particularly before, when things were not going well, I mean, towards the end. Howard gave lectures to the German army saying that death is not death, as Bhagavad Gita says. Death is, the soul is immortal, and you die in a fair battle. Your soul goes takes on a new body, and I mean, your body is destroyed. So kind of, I mean, it's so cynical in some ways, but that's how these people use their knowledge of Sanskrit to legitimize Nazism. But that's not really, that doesn't really come into the four institutions that I have looked up.
I briefly say something. We look forward to more questions and comments by Mishka. I'm just aware of that Daniel has to leave in 8 minutes. So if Daniel would like that, if Daniel would like to say something, ask a question or something like that, I would really like to give him a chance.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you. That's a very kind treatment, Thomas, and thank you very much for the talk and the comment. Unfortunately, I'm not really knowledgeable about this 1930s period, at least when it comes to India and Nazi Germany. But I studied lately a little bit the kind of anti-colonial activists in Berlin in the 1920s, and I looked up files in the German Foreign Office, and to me, it seemed this kind of close connection. I see a lot of continuities in the 1930s. I mean, it obviously builds on the 1920s, and probably for people in the Foreign Office, not so much has changed with regard to working with Indians and Indian nationalists and revolutionaries. And my question would be about the role of the industry. It seems that in the 1920s, at least, German companies trying to get access to the Indian markets are a reason of, you know, pushing the politicians in the Foreign Office to constantly, you know, keep this relationship going. And there is also some activities by these Indian nationalists financed by German industry, which is quite funny. And I was wondering to what extent the German industry during the Third Reich has a similar role to play. Do they see this as an opportunity? Would you also say there's a lot of continuity, or is this something that is more on the academic side that apparently is in the center of your book? And yeah, probably it's not the industry, but still, this was something I was interested in, and maybe you can say a little bit how this developed.
Well, I can say only a little bit. I have looked at the Indian side of the story. There was, of course, the presence of large German companies like Siemens, IG, whatever, IG Farben. IG Farben, as you know, was a conglomerate of various German companies. And they were the first people to become Nazis. The Nazi party in India was comprised of people who worked for these German companies. So there was a very close political connection between the German industry in India and the Nazi regime. And sometimes they sponsored Indian propagandists who don't really appear here so much, except in the first chapter. And sometimes they sponsored Indian nationalists or whoever, Indians working for German industries to propagate Nazi, the glories of the Third Reich and Hitler in India. So there was a presence. Allianz and Stuttgarter was very well known for sponsoring this kind of activities. And they are also the people who finance some of the scholarships that India Institute gives out. So there's a very deep and widespread entanglement there. And that's, of course, a subject of a different book, but it's there very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Mishka, do you have more questions, more comments?
Yeah, I'm actually really interested now in this question about the industries. Is this something? Is this something that continues post-war? Do we continue? I mean, is there a return to after independence to building on any of these contacts with German companies?
Yeah, there is actually. There are some continuities here also, though I don't really know much about that because it's not the subject of my study. But, my father-in-law worked for the Siemens, and he used to tell us that there were pre-war and post-war continuities as far as India was concerned. And of course, there are works by economic historians like Christina Lubinsky, who looks at German business practices in India. There you can also find more better researched stuff on that. But industry was very much involved in this network between Indians and Germans, Nazi propaganda in India, and helping Indian colonialists, anti-colonialists in Germany.
And were there pre-Nazi? And what were these networks building at all on any pre-Nazi networks that existed?
Yeah. Before the First World War, I think from the late 19th century, German industry started to set up business in India. And for that, of course, they were hand in glove with the British. They had to collaborate with the British. And also the Germans in India saw themselves as part of the colonial ruling elite. They were not really so much into Indians. Yeah.
Oh. Daniel, are you raising your hand or are you waving goodbye? If you raise your hand, the floor is yours.
I raised my hand because I have to wave goodbye in a second, but I wanted to, basically it's not a question, but I think a comment that I think the kind of German-Indian case is really interesting because of the continuities. Before the First World War, during the First World War, 1920s, and then the Nazi period and after. And, in a way, there is the risk, of course, Nazi history in a way gets more attention and it sells. But to me, at least, with my limited knowledge, this continuity is as much worth exploring as it is the kind of new elements that Nazism brought in. And I really have to go to another meeting, but thank you very much. Really interesting talk. And I actually have the book on my reading list for the winter break. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. And yeah, I was actually also thinking about this continuity between foreign interference during the First World War and now during the Second World War. But back to you, Mishka.
No, I mean, really, I know that that's not specifically what your book's about, but in terms of the wider context, because, in a sense, what's really interesting in this book is that it's trying to build a narrative which, because one of the things that I've always had a problem with is how do you separate the scholarly enterprise of Indology from the culture politics that and industry and economy, because there are deep integrations. One of the kind of ideas of the 19th century university, which is pioneered in Germany, and the kind of Wilhelm Humboldt's idea of Wissenschaft, this idea of a free knowledge, it is this idea that, research for research's sake, knowledge, Forschung, knowledge for knowledge's sake, and that is the birth of what we assume to be the normal for universities today, because pre-Humboldt, the universities are, at least in Britain and the United States, and these are very much places of religious training, or and so that idea of knowledge for knowledge's sake, in a sense, never exists, does it? It's a construct from the beginning, and so whatever these continuities are, there those nexuses, they may not be about Nazism in particular, but there are things that exist that pave the way. Nazism doesn't just come out of nowhere, like ab ovo. So I don't know what you think, and and similarly, I think that in India there are pre-existing notions of claims to history and authenticity and culture that say even someone like Ramon Roy, when he's doing his early translations of Vedic texts, is trying to build an idea of an anti-superstitious kind of Vedic monotheistic culture, which is very much based on Vedantic sort of Vedantic philosophy, in a sense, as an argument against colonialism, because colonialism, as one of the groundings of colonialism is that Hinduism and Indian religions are essentially inferior because they're rooted in these irrational religious ideas, and so in a sense, it's a kind of Protestantization of knowledge right from that period. And so in a sense, the possibility of informing knowledge with ideology is a possibility that exists from much earlier, would you say?
Yes, I mean, I was reading Susanne Marchand's book called German Orientalism in the Age of Empire, and it provides such a lucid account of what kind of researchers were patronized by the state. Because at the end of the day, all of us, as humanities scholars, are dependent on patrons. We can't just go into research, researching X, Y, and Z. I mean, I was dependent on DFK for financing this, and there was this very early form of state patronage and research in German universities, and all the professors were selected by the Kultus Ministerium. So yeah, I mean, there is you can research I suppose things which are non-commercial or whatever, non-practical, but they have to be approved by the state first. You get a tenure in the German university based on your research profile, and what is that research profile? And that wasn't any different in the early 20th century or in the late 19th century. So there were the first Indologists who got their chairs in Berlin, wrote, for example, they justified their positions as through this position we can spread Christianity in India. So there was this practical aspect. They were researching Veda or whatever, apparently things which are not connected in any way to modern day politics. But one of the things was, yeah, through Vedas, we are going to teach Indians to go back to monotheism and ultimately to Christianity, which is the best form of monotheism. So, I mean, as you said, it was a construct that what Humboldt propagated.
And this is true in the British Empire as well. I mean, the Bowdoin Professorship, when it is founded on the grounds that they want to spread Christianity in India through teaching Sanskrit to British, colonial administrators and, people who go out to India. So, and that continues to be the case that there are the reasons for studying Sanskrit, even when they don't work. So, for example, there is no evidence at all that teaching Sanskrit in Oxford had any effect on the spread of Christianity in India. Quite the opposite. There is no evidence that teaching Sanskrit at Oxford or in British universities, in any way improved the prospects of empire in India. But it continued to be an argument that was made.
But some German Indologists had connections with anti-colonialists long before the Nazis. Paul Deussen, at the turn of the century, was a friend of Vivekananda. And Paul Deussen was very critical of British rule, and Paul Deussen was the one who kind of influenced Vivekananda to preach Vedanta. So there was anti-colonialism and Vedanta studies kind of coming together. But what was different during the Nazi period was they were much more vocal, they were much more straightforward about this, and they had this contempt for what they considered to be Luxus Professoren and orchid subjects. For them, a scholar was basically somebody who was propagating, who was fighting for the Nazis within the classroom. So there was this concept of a scholar soldier. Some people fight on the battlefield and some people fight in the classroom, but the thing they do is the same.
Yeah. And Paul Deussen also had these dialogues with Nietzsche, didn't he? There's a because they were friends and then they fell out. But it's an interesting, because there's this whole kind of history of Nietzsche's contribution to Nazi ideology as well. And Paul Deussen is very much against some of those ideological formations. So it's an interesting, I just wanted, last question, I'm going to shut up because I've been talking for too long, but do you think that some of these ideas of the scholar soldier, some of these ideas of knowledge being, being legitimately something that should promote the state, are actually adopted into the ways in which Hindutva politics uses, ideas of Sanskrit and ancient India?
They definitely use some very archaic Orientalist stuff, like they try to find the Vedic river Saraswati by using drones. And Saraswati is a river which is mentioned only in the Vedas, and nobody knows whether it actually existed or whether it was just a metaphor for the goddess of learning. And there's one point in the Vedas which says Saraswati has disappeared because she could not stand the untouchables. And now the Hindutva, the Hindu nationalist government is trying to find the river somewhere, and they're trying to link up the pre-Vedic Harappan and the Indus civilization with the Vedic civilization by calling it Saraswati, Harappa Saraswati civilization, which is totally ahistorical. But this is not related, but all the Indologists I have studied were very embarrassed about the presence of this pre-Vedic, highly developed Harappa civilization, because for them, it was the Nordic Aryans, the white European Aryans who brought civilization to India through the Vedas. And how can you reconcile that with the existence of a pre-Vedic, very highly developed Harappan civilization? So their books, when they write the history of India, they devote one paragraph to the Harappan civilization and then go on to write like the 3 chapters on how glorious the Vedic civilization was. Yeah, and Hindutva is also, Hindutva goes a step further. It tries to link up the Harappa civilization with the glorious Vedic civilization, is one way I see it, yeah.
By making fake seals where they bring in horses where they don't
that
exist.
I don't know, but I have just read essays on the existence of Harappa Saraswati civilization, which is totally,
Actually, but what's interesting, because you use the example of a Tamilian translation. Now, Tamilian, of course, is not an Aryan language. No, it's a Dravidian language. And it's interesting because at least in Britain, certainly in Oxford and Cambridge, there is a hierarchy of languages. And kind of
Germany,
it's only,
it was like that too.
And so nobody's teaching Tamil, nobody's teaching the non-Aryan languages, even vernaculars, are not seen as worth studying and teaching until much later. And in fact, a lot of these kind of languages like Tamil and languages like Pali, etc., are they're not, there has to be an argument, a serious argument made for them to try to incorporate them into teaching. So it's interesting that Tamil is being used to propagate Hitler. It's very, it's something that I have not seen before.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, but you must remember where this is being done. This is not being done at a main Indology department. This is an organization which deals with modern India, and the purpose of it is to train businessmen and spies. Basically, by the time the SS comes into the play, it wants to train spies who can go to India and collect information about the British Empire. So from the beginning, the Oriental Seminar and its successors were not as prestigious as the Indology department. They were places where kind of colonial administrators and businessmen and people like that who were not scholars were trained. And so who were the teachers? There were people like Hermann Bertan, who was, of course, a well-known authority on Tamil. He lived in India for a long time and learned Tamil and produced work, but he's not regarded as, somebody as respectable as Ludwig Alsdorf. That is why the only professorial post that is created there goes to Ludwig Alsdorf, who studies proper Indology, Sanskrit and Pali. So there's a hierarchy still existing, but this institute focuses on modern India, wants to train spies, diplomats, and businessmen. It employs people who are not like the top scholars, but people who are more, practical trainers.
Thank you. I think, Tom, I'm going to stop asking questions. Are there other people? Because, I could go on sitting here and talking till the cows come home, but probably not a good idea. So it'd be great to have other people ask their questions.
Well, it would be a wonderful idea, but it will also be wonderful to hear from others. Anyone who would like to say something? Maybe actually I also like to ask something. I mean, I know the book really focuses on the scholarly side of things, but they're of course also from the Nazi perspective or the Nazi imagination, very much part of the when we call it, well, maybe less disinformation, more foreign interference campaign, propaganda campaign in India, aimed at weakening the hold of Britain over India and of, in a way, pushing the German strategic narrative. So in a way, I was just wondering if, even if this is on the sidelines of your research, whether you could share a little bit with us about what the extent is to which Nazi authorities were involved in this. So which of the institutions were involved with this? And also maybe what I would really be interested in, and I understand if you may not have an answer, is about the extent to which Nazi authorities were trying to evaluate or measure the impact all of this had in India in order to further the Nazi cause. Did they think that they were getting anywhere, or was this something where they were just kind of throwing things against the wall and hoping that things would somehow stick?
To your first question, mostly it was the foreign ministry that was involved, because there was this tussle between the propaganda ministry and the foreign ministry about who was going to disseminate propaganda in the foreign lands, and ultimately Ribbentrop kind of won over. So he was the one who had a big stake, who had a lot of say in this. And then there was SS. As I said, SS was very much involved also because Himmler was interested personally in India. He had this kind of exotic fascination for India, and he got along well with Bose. He was the only Nazi leader who took Bose seriously. So Himmler is interested. And if I say this, Indians would probably be very angry with me, but the entire Indian venture in Germany came under the SS because Franz Alfred Six, who was one of the members of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, he was put in charge of the Sonderreferat Indien. which was again a part of the information department of the foreign ministry. So actually the whole Indian operations from 1943 onwards came under the SS, which had a big say. And your foreign ministry also had a big say. And then of course the Wehrmacht, for the fourth case study, the Wehrmacht, the interpreters were very much controlled by the Wehrmacht. And to your second question, the Nazi authorities, you know, they were not very convincing. The Indians saw through their game because Hitler was very, very contemptuous about anti-colonial movements in Asia. He called them Gaukler and whatever, meinetwegen anti-colonialist and blah, blah. It is very well known. And he called the Indians racial bastards. Both for Hitler and Rosenberg, it was Indians were a kind of negative example of what happens when a good Aryan race degenerates into black, kind of niggers and black Asians. So they were fallen Aryans, and Indians knew this. So after 1938, when Ribbentrop strategically tries to promote Indian nationalism and to promote that, oh, we are great friends of Indian nationalism, we want to help Indians to attain freedom. In India, the Congress gives a public rejection. And the Germans know this, but they still pretend as if nothing's happened, and they keep throwing things. The Germans know that it's not working. The only person who took this seriously was Bose, and Bose had a good image. But then again, Bose's image was that he took help from the Nazis, but he was not implicated in Nazi politics, which is also not wholly true.
Thanks. Just 1 second, Julia. That's really interesting. In a way, I would say, well, don't underestimate that there are actually other foreign policy players, particularly when it comes to foreign interference. But in a way, their absence, in a way, actually speaks quite loudly, if that makes sense. And that, in a way, I wonder, and I'm speculating here, whether that is in a way because from a Nazi imagination, dealing with India is a function of also on how to deal with Britain and her empire. In particularly, I would imagine at a time in which the Nazis were still very actively pursuing a deal with the Nazis, so with the British, they would obviously try not to, at that point, to antagonize the British, because, well, they want to have a deal. In that, it's also interesting that you focus here on what Ribbentrop then is doing after 38, because prior to that, you had really, you're right, there's the propaganda ministry and the competition with the Foreign Office, but then there are also the various Nazi party agencies that are also involved in foreign propaganda and foreign interference. There's the Amt Rosenberg, there's the initial Ribbentrop Amt, which is at that point not part of the Foreign Office, but of course at that point they're trying to pursue a deal, but Ribbentrop stops to do so after 38. And the Auslandspresseamt of the NSDAP in Munich, they also do foreign interference, actually particularly in Britain, but in a way it is maybe, I'm speculating here, I would imagine that the very fact that after 38 it is Ribbentrop who is pushing for this makes sense, because he has turned against Britain while these other competing foreign interference circles, particularly around Rosenberg in the Auslandspresseamt, they still behind Ribbentrop's back try to pursue a deal with the British.
Yeah, in the first chapter, for example, I comment on how from 1933 to about 1938, the message to Indians was that Germany is great. And the India Institute used to encourage Indian nationalists who were kind of mainstream, who were also acceptable to the British establishment. So Germany was kind of doing a tightrope walk there, not antagonize the British too much, also because they needed to have the British support for their business in India, but at the same time subtly encourage Indian kind of nationalist-minded scholars and mystics and whatever. But from 1938, the game changes. And the other three institutions that I look at are all during the war. So then it's completely out in the open that they are fighting the British. They fight the Nazis, try any which way to convince the Indians that, you must rise up against the British because Germany is on your side. So yeah, there is this element of. And Rosenberg, for example, is very interested in Ludwig Alsdorf. He sets up this Hohenschule in München, and he wants Alsdorf to teach ancient India there. But the SS wants him to teach modern India in Berlin, and ultimately SS wins over. So there's this tussle.
It's fascinating in a way, and I guess unsurprising given kind of Rosenberg's interest in India and so on. But we have a final question from Julia, or point or intervention.
I actually just have a very short question. It's because you were talking about Jewish scholars, and this kept me thinking about what John Efron and I think it's Derek Pensler said about Orientalism in Jewish thought, that especially Spanish-speaking Jews look to the kind of Orient to talk about themselves. And I was wondering, those Jewish scholars you were mentioning, so what was their main interest? If you heard, read about it or something, because I'm always wondering, why India? So why were they looking on Sanskrit and everything? So what was the main interest they might have, or any speculations you might have?
I don't have a lot of answers to that, but I read somewhere that Indology was a marginal kind of niche subject, and it was easier in some ways for a Jewish scholar to get into a subject like Indology than, for example, in history or German literature, because it was marginal and not many people studied it. And if you were good, and you had a chance of getting a tenure, even if you were Jewish. And some of these scholars did not think of themselves as Jews. They were converted. So some of them were very interested in doing the kind of racialized Aryan thing, because they thought of themselves as Aryans, only to be told by the Nazi regime that they were not. And also there is this contradiction. I was telling my students that Mishka mentioned Betty Hyman, who was the only woman Indologist, and she was a Jew. And among the people who supported her, she had a terrible time in the German academia because she was doubly marginalized. And one of the people who support her, and I've seen this in archives, is Jakob Wilhelm Hauer, who is completely fanatically anti-Semitic. But he supports Hyman because he likes Hyman's work. And also people like Walter Wust, sometimes they liked some works by the Jewish Indologists. They thought it was wissenschaftlich, such works were wissenschaftlich sound. So these are the things that I have come across. I'm afraid I can't tell you more.
No, this is a very good answer. Thank you very much.
That sounds very great. We have one final question by Mishka.
No, it's not a question, actually. I was just going to respond to Julia, if I may. I mean, if it depends. So I think Dia spoke more about the 20th century. In the 19th century, it's the study of Indology or the study of Sanskrit is actually a very coveted subject in Germany, because in the early 19th century, there is a very important book written by Franz Bopp about the comparative grammar of Sanskrit and Indo-European languages, and that book gets taken as proof or evidence that European languages can be understood in the history of Europe, and European peoples can, or at least the European peoples they're interested in, which is Western Europe, can be interpreted through studying these early languages. And at this time, they believe that Sanskrit may be an Ur language, which it isn't. It is a parallel language, but it is at this point seen as an Ur language, studying the grammar of which is almost like studying the layers of the earth. So it's compared to geology. And so, rooting into philology through Sanskrit will yield this understanding of the European past. So therefore, Sanskrit is seen as a key, the key to philology. And that is one of the reasons why everybody studies Sanskrit. But Jewish scholars, because they're often, at least in the 19th century, they're often trained in Hebrew and Arabic. because they study the Torah and they study other, they also they study the Bible, the early Bible, and therefore they are very well trained in comparative language, using with Oriental languages, because Hebrew is an Oriental language, of course, and Arabic, and so and then it makes sense for them to then study. So they've got Hebrew, Arabic, they've got Chaldee, Aramaic, and then they study Sanskrit as well, and it's primarily for biblical exegesis. So it is for the study of the Bible, in which there are a lot of Jewish scholars who are doing this work, because they are, because Judaism is, it's so connected with the relationship with the text, with the book. It's part of the way in which intellectual Judaism is historically, it develops. And so Sanskrit is another string to their bow that they believe at this point to be really important. So very often you do have Jewish scholars who are, because they are just very good with language and with textual analysis.
Yeah, and Susanne Marshaw shows us that by the beginning of the 20th century, the paths were kind of diverging. The Jewish scholars were increasingly confined to studying their language, Hebrew and whatever, and because they were not getting patronage from the state, and the Sanskrit studies were increasingly getting more patronage, and there were more non-Jewish scholars. But then I know about from the 1920s, the situation changed somewhat because, as I said.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for your talk. Thank you, Mishka, for your response. Thank you for everyone else for their contribution. We clearly must have both Dia and Mishka back. So thank you so much. And I'm stopping the recording